Welcome to the Emeth podcast. I'm your host, Alexander, and this is my co-host, Connor.
What's up?
Last time we talked about, what does it mean to follow the gospel? Not just knowing the gospel, but actually genuinely living it out, and what it kind of looks like to live out the gospel. And one thing that I'm wanting to take these first couple episodes with is looking at big abstract ideas. So not just focusing in on, say, like church history, which I do want to look at. I think that'd be really cool.
Yeah.
But kind of more abstract and broad things like first episode, like what is truth? Like what does that mean? What is the Bible? What is that church like in a big picture sort of way? What does that look like? And one particular topic that is very big picture, but also foundational, is the topic of meaninglessness. And luckily, we have like a book in the Bible about meaningless. Oh man, what's it called? It starts with the E
and ends with the Ecclesiastes.
yeah, Ecclesiastes. And so we're kind of going to look at Ecclesiastes because Ecclesiastes makes an argument for the meaninglessness of life and how without God, there is no meaning. And so we're going to look at these two questions and see if we can find answers. Can meaning exist outside of God? Okay. And where does meaning come from? If it can exist outside of God, where does it come from? And if it can't exist outside of God, then what does that look like in our lives?
Pretty big questions.
Yeah.
I think kind of with that, those are very, I guess, important questions to be asking, because whether you're religious or not religious, I feel like it's hard to ignore those questions.
Yeah.
I think at one point or another, all of us ask ourselves, like, why are we here? Why were we created?
Yeah.
What's the point of all of this, right? These really big questions that we wrestle with and oftentimes don't want to wrestle with because the answer maybe isn't easy, or we don't know, or we feel like we don't know, so yeah.
Well, like one question that I tend to like to ask a lot is, why do we feel like we need a purpose? Like, what's the point in having a purpose? And so like I turn to science and look at science and be like, okay, evolutionarily and materially, like, what is our purpose? And our purpose is to reproduce, right? It's to carry on our genetics to the next generation.
Survival.
Yeah, survival. It's not necessarily like people say survival of the fittest, but really it's just survival of those which can pass on their DNA. And so you have like really weak, I don't know, like flies, right? Who aren't very strong at all, but they're able to reproduce super quickly, and so they're able to make it and they survive. So when we look at our purpose from a purely evolutionary perspective, and we look at our purpose, realistically, our purpose comes from having kids, right? Like, that is what should give our souls satisfaction. That's what should give our hearts fulfillment, and what should bring us the most joy is, having children. And I think for a lot of people that does bring purpose, is like, and meaning and purpose. But then after you're done having kids, then like, what's the point?
Yeah, then you're just stuck with some kids and you're like, now what do we do?
Yeah. And I mean, like, some people just aren't able to have kids, and so does that mean if you're not able to have kids, you're just gonna be like have no meaning your entire life? Like, is that the one determiner of value? And it's like, I don't know if that is.
Yeah, I sure hope not.
So if we don't see people's purpose being through reproduction, if that's not the measure of our purpose, then what is? Like, how do we measure whether or not someone has a meaningful life, and like what brings them meaning in their life?
Hmm.
And so, when we look at the material world, there aren't a lot of answers. Like, there aren't a lot of, like, I mean, there's stuff like responsibility, giving people a responsibility that gives people meaning, and other stuff, but those are more like, they're not helping solve the problem of the soul problem of bringing fulfillment, but it's just like kind of putting help,
Like a band-aid.
yeah, band-aid.
Well,
It's treating the symptoms.
Yeah. Because like I mentioned before, like everyone recognizes this thing, right? That they're wondering and wanting a meaning and a purpose. So we try to do that. We say, "Oh, well, I've got this job, and I work super hard and do the best job I can, and that's my purpose, is to just be here and work hard and do good." And it's like, yeah, I mean, that might be part of your purpose. I think that can be important. And someone else would say, "Oh, my family, my kids, to be a good dad, to be a good mom. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm on earth." And it's like, with both of those, it's like, okay, so you get hurt at work, or you fail, like you mess up at work, something goes bad. It's like, all right, there, your purpose is gone. Like, that's it. You can't work for a month. You have no meaning. You have no purpose.
And what happens when, like, you die or your kids die?
Yeah.
And it's like your whole life, they're like, what's the point?
Yeah, it's all ripped away in a moment. And then you're just left there wondering. And I think, like, that's kind of all the world has to offer. Is this false hope, in a way, of we convince ourselves that this is why we're here. And I'm guilty of this too, like, of going, oh, well, as long as I show up to work and do a good job, and I'm a good friend and do what I can, then everything will be great, and I have meaning, and it's great, right? But no, that's that's it doesn't work like that. Like, it, at least in me, I can do all of the right things and try really hard, and it still feels empty. Like there's something else, right? Like that's missing. That just isn't there. And I think that's where God comes in. Where, like, that's my soul longing for more. And recognizing that this isn't it. It's not the only thing. And I think especially in those times, like, I have to come back to my true purpose and my true meaning, which is in God and through God. What he has for me, not what I think I'm supposed to do. And that's that kind of wrestling match of life that I experience. And I'm sure a lot of people experience.
And we'll look at that when we go through Ecclesiastes, and we look at different instances of, like, control. Like, is there meaning in controlling your life? Like, does that bring meaning? I think one, like, a clue to trying to understand, like, where our meaning comes from, where our purpose comes from, is in the fact that we have the desire to have a purpose in the first place. Because the thing with desires is that you don't desire something that you can't conceive of obtaining, right? Like I think a really good example, it's hard to, like, come up with examples of human examples, because in, like, not being able to conceive of it for us to desire, like I'd have to conceive of it in order to have an example. But I think good examples are, like, when we see animals, right? A dog has zero desire to write a book. Like, no desire whatsoever. Like, it's not even on their radar, right? All they care about is sniffing butts and eating food and chewing on bones, because that's how that's what's in front of them, right? A fish doesn't complain that the water's wet, right? Like, that's an idea that C.S. Lewis brings up, is that, like, like, fish don't really want to, like, climb trees or walk on the ground because that's not something that's like conceivable for them. They have zero desire for that. And, you know, you may be like, well, I have a desire to, you know, orbit a foreign star. You know, I have that desire, but when we take that specific example and we strip away and we look at the core of that, it's like, well, that's more the desire for exploration, which is something that we can do. And, you know, in the Bible, God says, go out into the world and multiply and explore. And so that specific desire is just a remnant of a more fundamental desire that is achievable, that is within our realm. So when you look at if we have desire in the first place, have the desire for a purpose, then we must be able to obtain it in some way, shape, or form. Otherwise, we wouldn't be desiring it. So that's an argument for against, say, nihilism, which says that, oh, well, life is completely meaningless. Life is without, there's no point, right? Or completely meaningless. And it's like, well, the fact that we have the desire for a purpose in the first place tells me that we're able to obtain it. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm not a nihilist. But then when we confirm that there is a higher purpose that exists somewhere, it's like, well, where do we go to find it? And so we've looked at our source of truth being science, and we've looked at like philosophy and reason and thinking through kind of what, but now let's look at the kind of next source of truth, which is scripture as one of our sources of truth for spiritual truth. And maybe there'll be answers in the scriptures. And so in Ecclesiastes, there are 4 major questions that get asked that they answer, right? The first question is, what is meaninglessness? Like what is meaningless? Like when we look at the world and we look at all the things that people are doing in the world, which things have value and have meaning and which things do not? The next question is, why are these meaningless? All right, we've come up with a list of things that are meaningless, but why are they meaningless? Like, why can't I find my sole value in this thing and have purpose through this thing? The third question is, what is meaningful? I mean, if we have this list of what's meaningless, what is meaningful? Like, how can we experience purpose through these things? And then the last thing is, why are these things meaningful? Like, where does their meaning and value come from?
So what is meaningless? To get more specific, I think a lot of times people seek after wisdom and knowledge and information. And while I think they're important, and it's good to have wisdom, knowledge, and information, and to do research, I think if that's your meaning and that's your purpose, it leads to madness, where you're obsessing over this one thing and you have to find the answer and you have to know everything and you have to be the best at knowledge. You have to be the smartest guy in the room all the time. And it's exhausting. And we're incapable of that. That's not what we were designed for. I think we were designed to learn and to know and to be wise. But if that's the only thing we're seeking after, it's meaningless.
And it's really interesting because when we look at the scientific community, someone who knows a lot and is well read and has made these discoveries, you know, like 100 years later, it's all outdated. So
because we keep making new discoveries and go, well, maybe they weren't right, or what they did discover is so insignificant to what we're discovering now. I mean, it's crazy. It fades away. And I think some of it's still important. I mean, it's crazy with like Einstein. This is a little side tangent, but I remember watching a video and it was talking about Einstein's, like, in his view, like his biggest blunder, his biggest mess up. He was like, "Oh, this formula, you know, I got it wrong. discovered it actually wasn't true. And I wish I remembered what it was actually about. But and then, like 50, 60 years later, they're researching that thing again, and they're like, oh, he was actually right. Like, even his, like, mess up, it was so, like, off the wall and, like, just wild what he discovered that everyone was like, no, that's not true. That can't be true. And even Einstein was like, yeah, no, that can't be right. But they come to find out, like, oh, it is actually right.
Wow. That's funny.
So, yeah, a little side tangent, but just thought that was cool. But yeah, so back to pursuing wisdom and knowledge. Like Ecclesiastes talks about in Ecclesiastes 1:18, if you want to look it up. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. So the more we're gaining in wisdom and knowledge, the crazier we become. Like he talks about earlier, I increased my wisdom more than anyone who ruled over Jerusalem before me, and experienced much wisdom and knowledge, and applied myself to understanding, and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this too is chasing after the wind.
Yeah.
It's like, wow. And I mean, not to, use my life for an example for everything, but I can't really help it. In my life, like, that's so true. Like, what we talked about on the last episode of chasing after all this theology and trying to have the correct thoughts about everything and to figure out God, who is this infinite being that we can't ever fully know.
Yeah, it's overwhelming.
Yeah, well, and even in the universe, like, our universe is ever expanding, and we could spend our lives trying to find all of the answers to this ever expansive universe and reach the ends of the galaxies and all, and it's like, why? Like, we can't. It's infinite, and we are only semi-infinite, right? Like, on this earth, we're finite, trying to figure out an infinite being and an infinite universe.
Yeah.
And it just drives us insane.
Yeah.
Because our brains can't grasp it, and we try so hard to force our minds and our brains to do something that it can't do. Yeah. Instead of just recognizing, like, oh, this is pointless. Yeah. This is not the meaning. So yeah.
That's a good one. I think another other ones are like pleasure. Pleasure and desire. Like, ultimately, when we look at our desire like motivates us to do things, right? When you have a desire to make a lot of money, it motivates you to, like, get that money. But then when you get the money, how many times is it where you get your goal, you accomplish your goal, and you're like, oh, that's it?
Yeah.
Like, this is what I had been striving for. And ultimately, desire is itself meaningless. There's, like, no point to it, because once you achieve your goal, then you're just empty. And same with, like, pleasure. When you have these desires and you indulge in your desires, when you indulge in the pleasures, it's not like those pleasures are going to be eternal. Like, they're eventually going to, like, disappear.
Yeah.
And if they're going to end, if there's no, like, everlasting pleasure, then it's like, oh, well, what's the point? And I think those are good examples.
Yeah. So, and I think so, like, talks about youth. And I think that's really interesting, because so often there's all these beauty creams and plastic surgery and
I have beauty creams.
Yeah,
I have no idea what that is.
Bro, you gotta check out the beauty creams. No, it's like, stuff to, like, rejuvenate your skin and make you look younger and, like, get rid of wrinkles and
everything. Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Like moisturizer?
Yeah, kind of, but it's, like, way more expensive and
really? Okay.
Freaking beauty products, man. It's a whole other thing.
I thought you were talking about, like, a type of person or whatever.
No. Well, maybe that's a thing. I don't know. Wow. But no, I mean, there's a whole industry for preserving youth. Yeah. To look young. And dude, there's this one guy who, like, has done all of this research and like he gets like freaking stem cells from like younger and like injects them into himself so that he can stay looking
What?
younger, and he has this whole like his whole life
That's crazy.
revolves around trying to like live longer and look younger, and it's like his obsession.
Do you know his name?
I don't.
I think
Do you know who I'm
I've seen
talking
an
about?
interview with that guy.
I'll try and like look it up while we're talking.
Yeah, I think I listened to an interview.
But it's like fascinating.
That's
like
yeah.
It's working.
Yeah.
But at what cost? Like that's literally his whole life.
Yeah.
Just trying to look younger.
Yeah. And ultimately, like, I'm assuming that he's gonna die eventually.
Oh,
and it's
yeah.
like all that work.
No.
And you're just like
still gonna die like the rest of us. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's so much pressure, especially I don't know about other cultures, but at least like in America, it's so important to like look the best you can and to look young and to stay beautiful and like all of this stuff. When the Bible talks about like don't focus on outward beauty, like beauty fades, but your inward being is what actually matters. So yeah, I mean, I think people chasing after youth, like what's the point? It all fades and we all die.
Ultimately, like you can't fight aging.
Yeah.
You can't fight death. Like you can try and you can succeed for a while, but ultimately, you know, the Grim Reaper is always around the corner.
Yeah. Well, and not all that to say, not to be like, oh, people who use those, you know, the cream to look younger, and all that, you know, like all that stuff, like they're no, like that's not what I'm trying to say, but
it is. I mean, that's obvious. Like when you look at what people believe, it's like you can learn a lot from where they put their money.
Yeah.
About like
absolutely.
what that person believes. And if that person is spending hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars on anti-aging stuff, then where's their heart? Like what do they genuinely believe will give them purpose? I think another thing is like wealth and things. We kind of talked about that with desire and pleasure. Like when we look at money, like you can have all the money in the world, but ultimately, like when you die, it's not like you can bring like a U-Haul into heaven or into, you know, Sheol or, you know, or even if like there's nothing beyond this world, like you're not going to bring any of your things.
Yeah, it'll just be nothingness.
Yeah, so what's the point in trying to collect them and get things and wealth? And there's just like no point.
It's like the pharaoh, like or like the pharaohs in the Egyptian time, where they would pack their tombs and have these giant tombs built, and like they would put all this stuff in there because they thought they could bring it with them to the afterlife.
Yeah, and they would like bury their wives alive and servants.
Yeah, crazy.
That is insane. Bury them alive.
Yeah. Sorry, I was looking for a verse, but I don't know where it's at. I'll find it.
Okay.
Eventually.
You did mention Connor work. How work. That's another thing that they bring up is meaningless. How you can work and work and work, but ultimately, like what's the point? Like when you look at like building I think really good examples are empires. When you work to build, say, the Roman Empire, that's something that people thought would never disappear. That's something people thought would last forever. So many people put so much effort into building this empire, building the cities, and ultimately, like, it all began to crumble. And how many times do empires fall and cities lie in ruin because ultimately, no matter how hard you tried and other people tried to preserve and work for that particular kingdom, it just completely fell apart. And there's, you know, it's like, what's the point in that?
Yeah. And I think, so, again, me as a personal example, but working construction and like working with my hands and like physically toiling, right, and coming home every day and just being exhausted and like wiped out,
dude.
And then thinking back and going, what did I like, what did I even accomplish? Which, granted, some days I literally accomplish nothing and it sucks. But no, I mean, it's like, what's the point of all of this? Like, if I just go to work and come home and do nothing else, like, why?
Yeah.
What am I doing it for?
Doesn't sound like a fun life.
No, because there's no meaning in it, like you were saying. And I think that kind of like ties into things that are meaningful.
Yeah.
So, like, it talks about God-given pleasure, right? Mm-hmm. And like when I think of that, I think of like relationships and community and God's creation. And like the beauty and the pleasure that it brings us.
That's one of the things that Ecclesiastes brings up, is that companionship. Is when we have companionship, you know, it makes life a little bit easier. Yeah. It makes the toils and the seemingly lack of purpose a little bit more bearable, and we're able to like live longer and have more fulfilling lives when we do have each other. Yeah. And I think it's important to make the distinction, because like whenever I heard that, I was like, like a girlfriend or a wife, and as a single person, I was like, shoot, well, I guess my life's meaningless. No, but it says like a brother and like a friend. You know, it's like having people come alongside you and not walking through life alone, I think, is one of the most important things. So often we just want to like isolate ourselves and try and do life by ourselves because it's quote unquote easier. Which in some ways maybe it is. But I mean, you don't have to deal with people's problems.
Yeah,
you know,
for sure.
But then you have your own problems, and then you're just by yourself suffering through your own problems, and it's like, maybe if I was more willing to deal with other people's problems, people would be willing to help me with my problems. Yeah.
Well, and I think in dealing with other people's problems, there is meaning in that. In the kind of coming alongside someone and picking them up, or even just listening, like literally doing nothing, just sitting there and paying attention to someone is the best thing you can do to someone who's like struggling and going through hard times, a lot of times. And I think in that there's meaning, and in relationship. So I mean,
that's good. I have power, which I kind of referenced this a little bit when we talked about empires, but no matter how much power you have here on Earth, you will eventually like not have that power. Whether it's like you're the strongest person, strongest athlete, there's always going to be someone who comes along and ends up being stronger than you, because you'll age and eventually die, and your power will be gone. And also like control. No matter how much you control your life, you are not in control of your life. And control, ultimately striving to control your life, will like it's like trying to roll a giant boulder uphill. It's trying to like, you know, phase through a brick wall. Like trying to control what cannot be controlled is ultimately fruitless and really difficult. Well, why is that, right? Why are these things meaningless? Well, it's like God's in control. Like God is the one who is sovereign. He is the one who's in control. He is the one who dictates like where you're born and what your life's gonna look like. He knows all these things, and he puts people in your life to bring you back to him. You know, there are also why are these things meaningless? Like, because time is cyclical. It constantly cycles, and like no matter how new or hip you're gonna be, eventually you're gonna be the old generation, and there's gonna be a new and hip generation that looks at you and be like, oh, why are you so old? That's crazy. Oh man, oldie pants.
Well, and like it talks about in Ecclesiastes and in the Bible, like we work and toil for all of these things, right? And work really hard, get all of this wealth and wisdom. And then the cycle comes around and we give it over to other people who didn't do anything for it, who didn't work for it. And who knows what they're going to do for it? Drive it into the ground, and then that's it. And it's toil, it's worthless.
Yeah.
Like there's no point.
Mm-hmm.
And then like it talks about in, let's see, where did it go? I just had it. In Ecclesiastes 6:10. Whenever he has come to be, whatever has come to be has already been named and is known. It is known what man is, and that he is not able to dispute with one stronger than he. So like what you were talking about with God being in control.
Yeah.
There are so many things in life that we don't have control over. And as much as we'd like to say we have control over it or convince ourselves that we have control over it, we don't. Like there's nothing in our power we can do. When our friend gets sick or our kid gets hurt or dies, we have no control over that a lot of times. And sadly, that's just how it goes.
Yeah.
But I think in all of that, there is still a God who gives us meaning through the hardships and through the things that are meaningless.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's so important to think about what is meaningful and what has meaning and what doesn't, so that when those things come that strip away our things that we thought were our meaning, we're not just left there wondering, in despair and hopelessness.
Yeah. Well, and it's like, if God doesn't exist, if we live in a world without any divine creator, and we're just here, the reason life is so meaningless is because there is death. Everyone will die, so there's no point. And injustice. There are no consequences for your actions, good or bad. It doesn't matter what you do, because in the end, we all have the same fate. So I don't have to be a good person. What's the incentive for me to be a good person? So I have a nice life here on earth, but what if I can get away with certain things? What if I'm able to, like, hurt this person here and hurt this person there, and the government doesn't care, because the government is just instituted by the people, and so just because the government says something's bad doesn't mean that all the things that the government says is bad, and it doesn't mean that everything that the government allows is good, right? Like I think a really good example is alcohol, right? That's something that the government is like, okay, that's okay. You can go and become an alcoholic, and the government, like, that's not illegal. But, like, that's not good for you, That's not a good lifestyle to be living, but the government doesn't care. And so, just because the government sometimes brings justice, well, what if the government doesn't exist? Or what about in countries where the government doesn't care about what you do? Or as laws are different, like, okay, well, you can get away with being, like, a huge jerk and, like, hurting people, like, really hurting people. And there's no consequences. There's no, like, it doesn't matter. You can die fat and happy, and it does not matter one bit, because we all die. And so life's pointless, so might as well just be pointless anyway. So what is meaningful, Connor?
Well, that's a good question. No, I mean, I think the things are meaningful, like, which we kind of touched on some of them already.
Yeah, we did.
I think, like, the blessings that God gives us and the good things in our lives. So, not, like, all the possessions and all the things that we have, and living for just all of that stuff. But I think it's, like I said before, like his creation and relationships and some of those some of those things he's given us, and like opportunities and things like that. Like, I think there is meaning in the blessings from God, but not necessarily like the physical things themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
like God's provision.
Yeah, because God has provided these things, we're able to delight in them.
Yeah.
And not necessarily like, it's not like those things bring meaning to our lives, but us getting to experience his blessings is meaningful, is purposeful. When I like enjoy the blessing of food, oh, thank you, Lord Jesus, for food.
Yeah.
That is such a blessing. I'm able to delight in it because God has given it to me. He's the one in control, and he has given me this food.
Yeah.
I think when we look at death, you know, we had the stark, really like death and injustice. Well, what is meaningful is life. It's the opposite of that. When we experience life and genuine life, like life eternal, like eternal life, full life, not just like eternal, it's long, but eternal, like it is full and satisfied. When we experience eternal life, like that is what brings value. We looked at how time is cyclical, and it's constantly like going in circles, and there's this cycle of death and destruction, but it's like in eternity when we fully, if the Bible is correct and we are created to be eternal beings, then we will live forever, and our life will not come to an end, and therefore our life will have more meaning. All the sufferings that we're undergoing now have a point. There is a point to those sufferings, and those sufferings make us stronger as people, give us strength. And so when we look at meaningfulness versus meaninglessness, we're like, okay, so at life and eternity, that's pretty meaningful. That brings some value.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, and you mentioned injustice as one of the things that is meaningless. And so I think clearly one of the things that's meaningful would be justice.
Yeah.
And luckily we serve a God who is just. And I think we can find a lot of peace and hope in that, because we don't have to enact our idea of justice on earth. It's not our job. And I think at times, you know, we are vessels of justice, and there is a system that enacts justice for a reason, right? But I think, like you said before, like, people get away with things.
Yeah.
Like, this world is not always just. It's unfair and unjust. But we can have faith and know that God is just, and in the end, those people will get what is rightfully theirs, right?
Yeah. There are actually consequences for your actions.
Yeah.
Like, what you do, you will be judged according to what you do, unless you're covered by the mercy of Jesus Christ and his grace. But if we don't submit ourselves to Jesus Christ, then we don't get the benefits of his grace. Yeah. Right? And we are just of the world, and we will be punished accordingly. I mean, that's what it tells me. That is meaningful, right? Whereas injustice, not really being judged, that is meaningless.
Yeah. And I think so often people try to focus on that injustice so much that it becomes their responsibility to be just, right? To enact that judgment. Yeah. And to try and tell people how to live their lives and try to punish people for not doing what they think is right, and just go down this road that only leads them to destruction and to meaninglessness, right? Yeah. Because in their mind, they're like, oh, these people aren't doing what I want them to do, and they don't think the way that I think, and they don't look the way that I want them to look. Yeah. And when you stop and think about it, it's like, what good does that do?
That's you trying to control.
Exactly. Yeah. That's you trying to play God. Yeah. And when we try and play God, it always goes bad, because we were never intended to be God, and we are incapable of being God. But when we try to live like God, how he truly is in his character, and we love people through their imperfections, and even though they don't look the way that we want them to look, and they don't say the things we want them to say, and they're imperfect just like we're imperfect, that is meaningful. And I think in a way, like, that is justice.
Yeah. And it's also too, when we recognize that God is a God of justice, then one way that we can glean meaning is from the fear of the Lord. That's something that Ecclesiastes talks about, is there is meaning in fearing the Lord and genuinely like having a reverence and respect for his sovereign power, for his control. And when we fear that when we do wickedness, he will punish us, then we genuinely are like, oh shoot, okay, let me follow Jesus. But you can't like say that you're a follower of Jesus and try and get the benefits of it without actually like obeying him. Right? Jesus asked like some of the disciples, he's like, why do you call me Lord, Lord, but you don't do what I say? Like, what? Like that's not how that works. And he gives a parable of like, in the end times there will be people who come to me and say, Lord, I cast out demons in your name. Lord, I healed people in your name. Lord, I did all this in your name. And Jesus will look at them in the eyes and say, go away from me. I never knew you. Right? You claimed to know me, but you didn't actually care about knowing me.
And I think that kind of ties into work, right? The meaninglessness of work and works. Like the Bible talks about, like our good deeds are like filthy rags to God. Because he doesn't want our good works. He doesn't want the things we can do. Like, he wants a relationship with us, and he wants our heart. And a lot of times that's harder for us than trying to force ourselves to do the good things. Because in our heads we go, oh, well, everything else in life is earned. Like, everything else in life we have to work for and we have to do. But God says, no. Like, this is a gift I offer to you. And that's hard to wrap our minds around.
Experiencing that grace. And being like, oh, genuinely, like, all I have to do is just like accept Jesus and believe in him and put my faith that he is stronger than I could ever be. And when we genuinely do that, when we genuinely put our faith in him, we will desire, our desires will start aligning with his desires. We will begin to want what he wants. We will begin to pray the prayers that he wants us to pray so he can answer them.
And like, it's him doing a work in us, not us doing the work in ourselves. Right? Because all we have to do is have faith and accept God's love and grace, and then he will transform us. Like the Bible says, like, he is faithful to complete the work that he has began in you. And I think that's so cool, but also so difficult. Because I just want to do it. Like, I want to work for it. But he just says rest. Just be with me, abide. And
remember him. That's the last thing. That's one of the things that Ecclesiastes kind of closes with a little bit, is youth and how youth is meaningless. But in your youth, remember him. Remember the Lord, rest and remember him. That's what Sabbath is all about. It's resting in the Lord and taking time to be like, Lord, this is all yours. My life, all the blessings that you have blessed me with, everything is yours, and I'm going to remember you and honor you through my rest.
Wow, that's good.
So these are meaningful, but ultimately, why are these things meaningful? Where does their meaning come from?
God.
Whoa. Yeah, like ultimately, right, if God doesn't exist, there is no justice, there is no life. Right? We will die a physical death, and there's nothing beyond that. And it doesn't matter what we do, there's no justice will not be brought. But if God does exist, then there is meaning in our lives. And like, because God gives us these pleasures and these blessings, God gives us justice, true justice. God gives us life, like life to the fullest. ultimately, like, our meaning comes from God. And so when we ask the question, okay, like, is there a purpose to our life? Ultimately, like, logically, there is a purpose, because we have the desire for the purpose in the first place. And if we didn't have the desire for a greater purpose, then it wouldn't exist. We wouldn't be feeling that desire.
Yeah.
And so, okay, a purpose must exist, but if God doesn't exist, then there is no purpose, right? If God doesn't exist, death and injustice are purposeless. Like, prove that life is purposelessness. So if we look at, okay, a purpose does exist, and life, like, has to be purposeful, but if the only way that we can have a purpose is through God, then doesn't that mean that, like, God must exist? You know?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would say so.
I mean, just logic, like, just thinking about it, thinking about the argument that Ecclesiastes, that the author of Ecclesiastes makes. I think Solomon is probably the author, but
yeah,
it's just like it
just makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, and like I've heard it talked about before, of like, something doesn't come from nothing. Like, you know, like, that's not how any of it works. So, meaning, like, we didn't come from meaninglessness. There is no meaninglessness that just created us and boom, we're here. It's like it came from something with meaning, who wanted us to have meaning, and like you said, like, that desire's in us, so therefore, like, there has to be a way to meet it. And to kind of put that on, like, ground level, right? For because, you know, me, I'm like, what are you talking about?
It's very abstract.
Yeah, exactly.
You need something concrete.
Yeah, like, I would say just take inventory of your life and, like, just where you are mentally and spiritually, physically, and go, what are the things in my life that I'm putting meaning on, or trying to make meaningful, or trying to make sense, that are meaningless.
Yeah, that just it's not working.
Yeah. And I'm talking to myself too, because I struggle with this too. Of what are the things that are meaningless in your life that you're trying to make meaningful, and what are the meaningful things in your life that you're making seem meaningless?
Yeah, you're treating as if they don't have value.
And I think if you just take a second and even just write it down, if that's what you have to do. But yeah, just take an inventory and just check in on where you're at. And I think all of us have areas in our lives that we're putting meaning on meaningless things, and making meaningful things meaningless. It's a lot of meaning going around here. But yeah, I mean, I think that would be a great way to actually make this applicable.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you, Connor. Also, thank you, beautiful viewer. Thank you for taking time to listen to this podcast. I'm just gonna ask that if you really enjoyed this podcast, that you share it with someone who you think also may appreciate it and enjoy it. I ask that, you just, like, post it on social media, or maybe wherever you frequent. Just, like, share it. Yeah, we'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
We really need to work on an email.
Yeah.
I think it'd be cool if we got an email.
That would be
cool.
And
then we could have people like write in questions and stuff. Yeah.
That's a good idea. Yeah. That's a good idea. We should do that. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of Emeth Podcast. We will catch you guys next time.
See ya.